Grand piano arrived at the auction house in pieces. Not figuratively, literally in pieces. The lid was cracked down the middle like a split jawbone. The soundboard had warped so badly that 3 bass strings had snapped clean off, their curled ends rusting against what remained of the bridge. 2 legs were missing entirely. The fallboard hung from a single hinge, exposing keys so yellowed and chipped they looked like the teeth of something ancient and dying. When the movers set the wreckage down inside the loading dock of Hargrove & Associates, Manhattan's most prestigious piano restoration firm, every technician in the building stopped what they were doing and stared. One apprentice actually laughed out loud. The senior restorer, a man who had rebuilt instruments for concert halls across 3 continents, walked a slow circle around the damage, then looked at the woman who'd brought it in and said 5 words. Nobody in the room would forget. "This cannot be saved, ma'am." Standing beside the destroyed instrument in a black cashmere coat, billionaire philanthropist Catherine Ashford didn't blink. She didn't argue. She simply pressed her lips together and stared at the piano the way someone stares at a casket before it goes into the ground. Because that's exactly what this felt like. Her father, legendary composer and pianist Julian Ashford, had built this instrument by hand over the course of 11 years. Every joint, every hammer, every pen shaped by his own fingers in the workshop behind their Connecticut estate. Julian called it the letter because he said the piano contained everything he never knew how to say to his daughter out loud. It was the only piano he ever built, and it was the last thing he finished before a stroke killed him quietly in that same workshop on a Tuesday afternoon in March. Catherine inherited the piano. She never played it. She never let anyone else play it either. For 9 years, it sat inside a climate-controlled room in her Manhattan penthouse, tuned twice a year by a specialist who flew in from Vienna. Then a pipe burst 3 floors above during a winter storm, sending water cascading through the ceiling and directly onto the instrument for nearly 6 hours before building maintenance discovered the flood. By the time they pulled the soaked quilted cover off the piano, the damage was catastrophic. Catherine stood in the doorway of the ruined room in bare feet at 2 in the morning and wept harder than she had at her father's funeral. She spent 7 months after that contacting every master piano restorer in the Western Hemisphere. She flew the instrument to a specialist in Hamburg who kept it for 3 weeks, then shipped it back with a 4-page letter explaining why the resonance profile of the soundboard was permanently destroyed. A workshop in London examined it and concluded the pin block had swollen and split internally, meaning the frame could never hold concert pitch tension again. A retired Steinway master craftsman in Queens came to her penthouse, spent 40 minutes studying the wreckage with a flashlight and a stethoscope, then told Catherine she'd have better luck commissioning an entirely new instrument. Julian's design philosophy was singular, he said gently. Nobody alive understands the acoustic architecture he used. I'm sorry. That's how the piano ended up at Hargrove & Associates, the last stop on a long, humiliating tour of rejection. And that's where the story would have ended, except for the man kneeling on the loading dock floor with a flashlight between his teeth, running his fingers along the underside of the fractured soundboard, while everyone else in the room had already moved on. His name was Daniel Voss. At 43 years old, Daniel was not the kind of man anyone noticed in a room. He was lean in the way people get lean from skipping meals rather than running marathons. His hands were rough, his flannel shirt was fraying at the collar, and his steel-toed boots had electricians tape-patching a split near the left sole. He worked the late shift at Hargrove, not as a restorer, but as a finish carpenter. He sanded casings. He replaced cracked legs. He applied lacquer coats in a ventilation booth at the back of the shop while the real technicians handled the instruments that mattered. Nobody at Hargrove considered Daniel a craftsman. He was labor. Reliable labor, sure. Quiet, competent, showed up on time, never complained. But labor, what nobody at Hargrove knew, because Daniel never told them, was that 15 years earlier, he had been one of the most promising acoustic engineers in the country. After graduating top of his class from the Eastman School of Music with a dual focus in piano technology and acoustical physics, Daniel spent 4 years designing resonance systems for a boutique instrument maker in upstate New York. He filed 2 patents before he turned 30. Industry journals called his approach to soundboard architecture intuitive beyond his years. He was building a reputation. He was building a life. Then, Grace got sick. Grace Voss, born Grace Kimura, was a cellist. a gardening obsessive, and the kind of person who remembered every cashier's name at the grocery store. She and Daniel met at a chamber music fundraiser in Rochester when she spilled red wine on his only good blazer and then spent 20 minutes trying to clean it with sparkling water, while apologizing so sincerely that Daniel fell in love before the stain was dry. They married 14 months later. Their daughter, Nora, was born the following spring. Grace was diagnosed with an aggressive form of pancreatic cancer 3 days after Nora's 4th birthday. She died 11 months later, on a Sunday morning, while Daniel held her hand and Nora slept down the hall, clutching a stuffed rabbit Grace had sewn from an old concert dress. What happened afterward wasn't dramatic. It was just erosion. Medical debt consumed Daniel's savings, then his credit, then his dignity. He sold the house. He sold his tools. He sold the patents for a fraction of what they were worth because he needed cash immediately, not royalties over time. The boutique instrument maker couldn't hold his position while he spent months as both caretaker and grief counselor for a child too young to understand why her mother stopped coming home. By the time Daniel resurfaced, the job was gone. His reputation had gone cold, and something inside him, the part that believed he could build beautiful things, had gone quiet in a way he couldn't explain and couldn't fix. He moved to the city because the city didn't care who you used to be. He found the job at Hargrove through a Craigslist ad. He showed up, sanded casings, replaced legs, went home to the one-bedroom apartment in Queens where 9-year-old Nora did her homework at the kitchen table, while Daniel heated up whatever was on sale at the deli downstairs. That was life. Not terrible. Not good. Just ongoing. But every night after Nora fell asleep, Daniel sat at the small desk wedged between the radiator and the window and studied. Not for any reason he could articulate. He just couldn't stop. He read acoustic engineering journals on his phone. He sketched soundboard designs on the backs of Nora's old-school worksheets. He watched grainy YouTube lectures about historical piano construction methods. And he studied, with particular obsession, the work of Julian Ashford. Julian's acoustic philosophy fascinated Daniel because it broke every rule Daniel had been taught. Where traditional builders relied on mathematical ratios to determine soundboard thickness and rib placement, Julian worked by feel, tapping the wood, listening to the response, shaving fractions of millimeters until the resonance matched something only he could hear. It was irrational, it was unscientific. And the results were, by every measurable standard, extraordinary. Julian's instruments produced a tonal warmth that acoustic engineers had spent decades trying to replicate through precision. He achieved it through instinct. Daniel spent years trying to understand why Julian's method worked. Somewhere around the 300th hour of analysis, he thought he finally figured it out. He never told anyone. Who would he tell? He was a Finnish carpenter who lived above a dry cleaner in Queens. So when the destroy piano arrived at Hargrove's loading dock that morning and the senior restorer declared it beyond saving, and Catherine Ashford's face went still and gray, Daniel did something he hadn't done in years. He spoke up. The rem is still true. Every head in the room turned. Catherine looked at him. The senior restorer looked at him. 3 apprentices looked at him with expressions that ranged from confused to amused. "Excuse me?" the senior restorer said. Daniel stood slowly, pulling the flashlight from his mouth. The rim. The outer case structure. It's bent slightly at the tail, but the lamination layers haven't separated. And the pin block? He paused, aware of how many eyes were on him. The pin block isn't split. It's delaminated in one quadrant, but the rest is holding. If you repress the separated layers with the right adhesive under controlled heat, it'll hold tension again. Silence. "And the soundboard?" the senior restorer asked, the way a teacher asks a student an obvious question to prove a point. "The soundboard's destroyed," Daniel said, "but it doesn't need to be replaced. It needs to be rebuilt. From the same wood species, with the same thickness gradient usually used. I know what that gradient is." More silence. Then the apprentice who had laughed earlier laughed again. "You sand casings, Danny." Daniel looked at the floor, his face reddened. For a moment it seemed like he might stop talking entirely, the way he'd stopped talking about his ideas for years, the way grief teaches you to make yourself smaller so the world has less surface area to hurt. But then he looked at the piano, at the cracked lid and the rusted strings and the broken hammers, at the wreckage of something someone's father built with his hands because he didn't know how to say what he felt. And Daniel recognized it. Not the piano. The grief. He recognized what it meant to lose someone, and then lose the last physical thing connecting you to them. "I know I sand casings," Daniel said quietly. "But I also know this instrument. And I know it can come back." Catherine Ashford stared at him for a long time, long enough that the senior restorer started to say something dismissive, and she raised one hand without looking at him to stop the words in his throat. "What's your name?" she asked. "Daniel Voss." "Why should I believe you, Daniel?" He didn't have credentials to offer. He didn't have a portfolio or business card or a reputation. He had a fraying flannel shirt and cracked boots and hands that smelled like lacquer thinner. What he said next wasn't rehearsed, wasn't polished, wasn't designed to impress. It was just true. "Because I spent 6 years studying your father's work, not because anyone paid me to. Because the way he built instruments is the most honest thing I've ever seen in this field, and honest things deserve to survive." Catherine's eyes changed. Not softened exactly. Opened, like a door that had been locked so long the hinges had almost rusted shut, against every recommendation from her advisors, her attorneys, and the senior restorer who told her privately that hiring a Finnish carpenter to rebuild a Julian Ashford original was an insult to the craft. Catherine gave Daniel the job. She rented a small workshop space in an industrial building in Long Island City, had the piano transported there, and told Daniel he had 4 months. The Ashford Foundation's annual gala, a black tie event attended by musicians, critics, and donors from around the world, was scheduled for October. Catherine wanted the piano on that stage, playable. Perfect, the way her father built it. 4 months to do what every expert in the world said was impossible. Daniel started the next Monday. He brought Nora. The workshop had no heat for the first 2 weeks. Daniel bought a space heater from a pawn shop and set it up near the corner where Nora did her homework after school. He taped her drawings to the cinder block wall: crayon flowers, a lopsided cat, a portrait of Grace she'd drawn from the photograph Daniel kept on the nightstand. While Daniel worked, Nora asked questions. "Why is the wood curved like that? What does resonance mean? Why do you keep tapping it with your knuckle?" Daniel answered every question patiently, the way Grace used to answer Nora's questions about music, and sometimes mid-explanation he'd stop and look away for a moment because the echo of his wife and his own voice caught him off guard. The first month was demolition. Daniel disassembled what remained of the piano down to its skeleton, cataloging every component, photographing every joint, measuring every angle. He discovered things about Julian's construction that confirmed theories he developed during years of late-night study. The soundboard ribs weren't placed symmetrically. They were offset in a pattern that followed the natural grain curves of the spruce, allowing the wood to vibrate as it wanted to rather than as engineering dictated it should. It was brilliant. It was also nearly impossible to replicate without understanding the underlying philosophy. Daniel understood it. He sourced Sitka spruce from a supplier in Alaska, the same species Julian used, selected from trees grown at the same altitude and latitude to match the density profile. He spent 2 weeks hand-planing the new soundboard, tapping the wood hundreds of times a day, listening, shaving, listening again. At night, after Nora fell asleep on the old futon he dragged into the workshop, Daniel sat on the concrete floor beside the emerging soundboard and ran his fingers across the grain the way a blind person reads a face. Feeling for something he couldn't see and couldn't fully explain, Catherine visited for the first time at the end of the 2nd month. She came alone, without advisors, without security. She stood in the doorway of the cold workshop and watched Daniel hand-fitting a new bridge to the rebuilt soundboard, while Nora sat cross-legged on the floor nearby, reading aloud from a library book about ocean animals. "How's it going?" Catherine asked. Daniel looked up. Sawdust in his hair, dark circles under his eyes. Slowly. "Is that good or bad?" "With your father's work, slow is the only speed that means anything." Catherine nodded. She didn't say anything else for 20 minutes, she just watched, and when she finally left, she paused at the door and looked back at Nora's drawings taped to the wall. The crayon flowers, the lopsided cat, the portrait of a woman she'd never met. and something shifted behind her eyes. She started coming every week after that. At first, the visits were clinical. She asked technical questions. She examined components. She compared Daniel's work to photographs of her father's original construction. But over time, the visits changed. Catherine began arriving earlier, sometimes before Nora got out of school. She brought coffee. She asked Daniel about Nora. She asked about Grace, not the way executives make small talk, the way someone asks because they actually want to know. One evening in late August, Catherine arrived to find Daniel sitting motionless in front of the partially rebuilt piano, his hands in his lap, staring at nothing. Nora was at a friend's house for the night. The workshop was silent except for the hum of the space heater. "What's wrong?" Catherine asked. Daniel didn't look up. "The hammers. Julian used a felt density I can't find anywhere. The 3 suppliers I contacted don't manufacture it anymore. Without the right felt, the hammer voicing will be wrong, and the entire tonal character changes. It won't sound like his piano. It'll sound like a copy." Catherine sat down on an overturned crate across from him. "How important is this?" "It's everything. Your father didn't build a piano. He built a voice. If I get every measurement right and the hammers are wrong, the piano will play, but it won't speak the way he intended. It won't say what he wanted it to say." Catherine looked at him for a long time. Then she said something that surprised them both. "My father kept journals. Dozens of them. They're in storage at the Connecticut estate. I never read them because I don't know. I think I was afraid of what I'd find. Or afraid of what I wouldn't find." She paused. "If there's any chance he wrote down specifications for the felt, they'd be in those journals." 2 days later, Catherine drove Daniel to Connecticut herself. Not a driver. Not an assistant. She drove, in a car that cost more than Daniel's annual salary, through 3 hours of turnpike traffic, while Daniel sat in the passenger seat holding a coffee and trying to figure out what to do with his hands. The estate was enormous. The workshop behind the main house was exactly as Julian left it. Tools hung on pegboards, wood shavings still on the floor, a half-empty cup of tea fossilized on the workbench. Catherine hadn't entered the room since her father's death. She stood in the doorway while Daniel stepped inside, and for several minutes neither of them spoke because the room still smelled faintly of linseed oil and cedar, and that smell carried something neither of them was ready for. They found the journals in a cedar chest beneath the workbench, 47 leather-bound notebooks spanning 3 decades of Julian's life. Some contained engineering specifications. Some contained sketches. Some contained letters to Catherine that he never sent. Pages and pages of a father trying to explain to his daughter why he was better at building instruments than building relationships, why he poured his love into wood and wire instead of words, why the piano he was building for her was his apology and his confession and his promise all at once. Catherine read those letters standing in her dead father's workshop, tears running silently down her face, while Daniel sat on the floor nearby, pretending to study hammer specifications he'd already found 20 minutes earlier. They drove back to the city in near silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. The kind that happens when 2 people have accidentally seen each other's grief and decided not to look away. Daniel found the felt specifications in journal number 31. Julian had sourced the wool from a specific mill in Bavaria that still operated. Daniel contacted them. They had the exact material in stock. He ordered enough for the full set of hammers plus spares, and when the package arrived 3 weeks later, he opened it with hands that shook slightly, not from nerves, but from the staggering awareness that he was holding a material chosen by a dead man's hands for a piano meant to say things the dead man's mouth never could. The final month was relentless. Daniel worked 18-hour days. He restrung the piano using custom-gauge wire matched to Julian's original tension calculations. He rebuilt the action mechanism, all 88 hammer assemblies, by hand, voicing each one individually until the felt response matched the tonal profile he'd spent years reconstructing theoretically. He repaired the cracked lid using a scarfing technique so precise that the joint was invisible to the naked eye. He refinished the case in the same hand-rubbed ebony lacquer Julian used, building up 12 coats over 2 weeks, sanding between each one with progressively finer grits until the surface reflected light like still water. Nora helped with the final polishing. She was careful and serious about it, the way children are serious about tasks they understand matter to the people they love. She buffed the curved legs with a soft cloth while Daniel tuned the instrument for the first time. When he pressed the first key, a single middle C, the note that emerged from the rebuilt soundboard filled the workshop with a warmth and clarity that made Daniel's hands go still on the keyboard. He played a C major chord, then a simple progression. Then he stopped, because he was crying too hard to see the keys. It wasn't just that the piano worked. It wasn't just that the tone was right. It was that the piano sounded exactly the way Julian Ashford intended. Warm, intimate, almost conversational, as if the instrument was speaking directly to whoever sat close enough to listen. Daniel hadn't just rebuilt a piano, he had resurrected a voice. He called Catherine. She came within the hour. She sat down at the bench, placed her fingers on the keys, the first time she had ever touched her father's piano, and played the only piece she knew from memory, a simple Chopin nocturne her father taught her when she was 12, sitting beside her on a bench in the Connecticut workshop, guiding her hands with patience he couldn't seem to find for anything else in their relationship. The nocturne filled the workshop. Nora stopped drawing and listened. Daniel stood by the wall with his arms crossed, watching Catherine play, watching her shoulders shake, watching her father's piano finally do what it was built to do. Nobody spoke for a long time after the last note faded. October arrived cool and sharp. The Ashford Foundation Gala was held at Lincoln Center in a hall that seated 800. Catherine had kept the restoration secret from everyone, board members, donors, press. The official program listed a special musical presentation with no further details. Attendees arrived expecting a guest performer, perhaps a string quartet, perhaps a notable soloist. Instead, they found the stage empty except for a single object hidden beneath a black velvet drape. The room buzzed with speculation. Industry journalists, who'd followed the saga of Julian Ashford's destroyed piano, assumed Catherine had finally accepted its loss and was unveiling some kind of memorial or tribute. Several music critics privately expected an embarrassing sentimentality, a billionaire's grief made public in a way that would be polite to endure and unpleasant to review. Catherine took the stage alone. She wore a simple black dress. No notes, no teleprompter. She spoke for less than 2 minutes. She said her father built a piano because he didn't know how to write a letter. She said the piano was destroyed and every expert told her it was gone forever. She said one person disagreed. Then she pulled the drape. The piano gleamed under the stage lights like something that had never been broken. The ebony case reflected the auditorium's ceiling in its surface. The restored lid curved upward, open and expectant. 800 people stared in absolute silence. Catherine gestured toward the wings of the stage. Daniel walked out in a borrowed suit that didn't quite fit right across the shoulders. Nora walked beside him, holding his hand, wearing a blue dress Catherine had bought for her the week before. The audience didn't know who they were. Some attendees later admitted they assumed Daniel was a stagehand who had wandered out by mistake. Catherine introduced him. She told the room about the Finnish carpenter who understood her father's work better than any expert in the world. She told them about the workshop in Long Island City with no heat and crayon drawings on the walls. She told them about a man who lost everything and kept studying because he believed honest things deserved to survive. Then she said something that made Daniel close his eyes. My father spent 11 years building this piano because he wanted to tell me something he couldn't say with words. Daniel Voss spent 4 months rebuilding it because he understood what my father was trying to say. Not because anyone taught him, because grief taught him, the same grief that taught me. And I think that's why the piano sounds right. Because it was rebuilt by someone who knows what it means to love someone. You can't reach anymore. The room was very still. Daniel sat down at the bench. Nora sat in the chair at the side of the stage, her feet not quite touching the floor. Daniel placed his hands on the keys. He didn't play a showpiece. He didn't play anything designed to impress. He played the same Chopin nocturne Catherine had played in the workshop, the piece her father taught her when she was 12. He played it simply, without flourish, letting the piano's voice do what Julian built it to do. The sound that filled Lincoln Center was unlike anything the audience had heard from a piano before. Warm, clear, aching, as if the instrument itself remembered something it loved. Critics who reviewed the evening later struggled to describe the tonal quality. One called it the sound of someone speaking very quietly in a room where everyone has finally stopped to listen. When the last note faded, the silence held for nearly 10 seconds. Then the room erupted. 800 people stood. The applause was thunderous and immediate and sustained for so long that Daniel didn't know what to do with his hands, so he just sat at the bench with his head slightly bowed, while Nora beamed from her chair and Catherine pressed her fingers against her lips to keep her composure. But the moment that mattered most came afterward. After the applause. After the journalists. After the photographers and the donors and the board members who suddenly wanted to know everything about the unknown craftsman who'd achieved what the entire industry declared impossible, Catherine found Daniel backstage, standing alone in a hallway, leaning against the wall with his eyes closed while Nora slept in a chair nearby, her head resting on the folded blue dress coat she'd taken off because the backstage hallway was too warm. "I have something to tell you," Catherine said. Daniel opened his eyes. "I'm creating a new division within the Ashford Foundation. A workshop dedicated to restoring and preserving historically significant instruments that would otherwise be lost. Not replicas. True restorations, the kind of work my father would have respected." She paused. "I want you to lead it. Full creative authority. Your own team. A real workshop, heated this time." Daniel looked at her. Then he looked at Nora, sleeping in the chair. "I want to name it the Ashford Voss Workshop," Catherine said. "After my father. And after Grace." Daniel couldn't speak. He pressed his hand flat against the wall behind him as if he needed to confirm that something solid still existed in the world, because everything else felt like it was dissolving. "You don't have to answer now," Catherine said. "Yes," Daniel said. His voice was rough. "The answer is yes." Catherine nodded. She looked at Nora. "She drew a portrait of her mother. On your workshop wall. I noticed it the first time I visited. She draws Grace every few months. From the photograph by my bed. She says she does it so she won't forget what her mom looked like." Catherine was quiet. Then, "My father built a piano for the same reason." They stood in the hallway for a while after that, not talking, while the sound of the gala carried faintly through the walls and Nora slept and the evening settled into something neither of them needed to name. 3 months later, the Ashford Voss Workshop opened in a renovated warehouse in the Red Hook neighborhood of Brooklyn. Daniel hired a small team of young craftspeople, most of them overlooked, most of them underlooked, most of them underestimated, all of them brilliant in ways their resumes didn't capture. Nora had her own desk in a corner next to a window overlooking the harbor. She still taped drawings to the wall. New ones, mostly. But Grace's portrait always stayed. On the first morning in the new workshop, before anyone else arrived, Daniel sat alone at a workbench and ran his hands across a piece of uncut spruce. He pressed his fingertips into the grain. He tapped it once with his knuckle and listened to the faint, clear ring that came back. It sounded like the beginning of something. Sometimes the people the world has written off, the ones sanding casings in the back of the shop, the ones working late shifts in cold rooms, the ones who lost everything except the knowledge in their hands, are the only ones capable of bringing back what everyone else has given up on. Not because they're fearless, because they understand what it costs to lose something irreplaceable, and they refuse to let it happen again.